there's a different level of training and competence in areas of sterility assurance and areas of assembling on the sterile processing side of things, what is given to a typical OR nurse in their orientation, in their onboarding in the OR.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
This week on First Case, we speak with Hank Balch, president and co-founder of Beyond Clean, and also actually sitting in behind the scenes, a co-founder of First Case as well. And so, Melanie, I know Hank's really kind of connected all the dots with the hosts on this show. It sounds like I'm the one connecting the dots, but really what's been happening is Hank networked with Paul, he networked with you, he networked with Jeremy and so many others in the industry, and really brought this amazing team together to be able to put together what I think is an excellent podcast. But Hank's experience is in the sterile processing industry. And we had a conversation recently over email and then kind of followed up on several of our team calls. And you mentioned just the variability that you've seen in the industry with inspecting things like blue wrap and filters. And you thought, boy, what a great conversation, for First Case that we should really dive into. And of course, we have brought Hank on for his very first appearance here towards the very end of our first season of First Case to talk about exactly that.
Hank really did a good job, I think, when he picked the hosts and the people to bring First Case together and to create this podcast. But I also think the experience that he has in SPD and what y'all have done with Beyond Clean is providing a valuable service to the SPD world. But then the way he talks about how there are times when the OR and SPD melds and meshes, and there are things that we do that overlap, and we can learn from SPD. OR has lessons that SPD is the expert, and we can learn from them. And the way understanding why we're doing those things that we're doing, the checking the wraps and the filters and examining our peel packs and all of these things are helping to make sure that we are keeping our patients safe and that we're protecting them from any possible contamination, and recognizing that we're not separate departments, but we're departments that are working together is something that I think Hank has done a good job shedding light on with all of the work that he's done with Beyond Clean, and then hopefully what we're helping do here at First Case. But I'm excited to get to talk to him more about it today.
All right, get ready for an engaging and informative interview. We'll be right back with Hank Balch, president and co-founder at Beyond Clean.
Hi, I'm Paul Wafer.
I'm Melanie Perry.
I'm Jeremy Gibson-Rohr.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
Joining us now is Hank Balch, president of Beyond Clean, and also my co-founder of Beyond Clean and a co-founder of First Case. And Hank and I really started by podcasting in the sterile processing industry. And then Melanie recently reached out and said, we should have a podcast interview really talking about some of the things that overlap between sterile processing and surgery that are really best practices and major indicators for quality in the operating room. And she's like, does anybody know a good guest for that? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I think we've got a great guest right on the team that may be a little bit behind the scenes for the First Case audience that's been listening to us since the beginning of the year in January. And with that, Hank, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Justin, and I appreciate the invite, Paul and Melanie, and hopefully I do not disappoint.
We hope that too, Hank.
Yeah, no pressure.
Well, Hank, let's talk a little bit about your experience, because I know you're very well known to the Beyond Clean audience. And again, that was kind of what kicked off all of these podcasts that we have now, 4 of them, including First Case. But what is your background in sterile processing? What makes you an authority to speak to us today?
So I started in the industry in 2009 as a frontline sterile processing technician. And like a lot of us in sterile processing, I had no intention whatsoever of making this a career, but I got the bug, as they say, got into leadership in 2013 and took over a department in Kentucky, ended up directing the health system out there. Then moved to Texas, directed a couple of other hospitals there in Texas at the sterile processing level. Shortly thereafter, actually, that's how Paul and I got connected. I began consulting around the U.S. And a lot of the conversation and consulting experiences obviously cross over into OR. There is no such thing as a solution to a sterile processing problem that does not involve the OR, either at the beginning or at the end of the solution. Through those experiences, obviously, in a hospital setting, it is a team dynamic. You always have to be working together on the perioperative side of things. You cannot work in a silo. On the consulting front, though, it became even more pronounced because you're not called in unless there's often a problem that's already there. And in kind of diagnosing that, it became very important to begin to understand more of those pain points that come from the OR side of things. And so I absolutely love these kinds of conversations and the interface in between the two. And I'm excited to see where this conversation goes.
One thing you humbly left out is the fact that the hospital you worked at in Kentucky won Department of the Year while you were there. So I want to give you another shout for that. Paul, how did you find Hank? Like, how did the two of you get connected?
Well, it's pretty interesting, actually. I saw some of Hank's posts on LinkedIn. I found his posts to be very interesting and also connected with the way my thought patterns worked. And so I reached out to him, and I actually wanted him to go to work for me in my company, Alpha Consulting Group, but we couldn't quite get to you guys were just forming Beyond Clean at that time, and we couldn't quite get to a point where we could make it work between us. But, I still wanted Hank to work with us. I told him I'd teach him how to do consulting work and that I had a bunch of work for him to do. The rest is history. We did a lot of projects together, had a lot of fun working together, and did a lot of good for a lot of hospitals, I think.
Yeah, those experiences, Paul, were really transformative in even the growth of Beyond Clean and now even into First Case, because again, you cannot be a good consultant if you don't understand the value of education. And of course, like, you're educating when you're on site, but one of the biggest frustrations on both sides of the consulting coin is you come in, you surface all the challenges, you educate around the recommendations and solutions, and then you leave and you hope that they implement the things that you have surfaced, and you hope that that education that you began continues, because you can only do so much when you're on site. And even through ongoing phone calls, there's only so much that you can do as an outsider looking in. It really comes down to, does the operating room staff and the sterile processing staff, are they going to own the problems in those recommendations and, again, like, implement those solutions long term? So that really continued to inflame my love of education and the value that I saw in education through that. And of course, like, as these podcasts have continued to grow, that's a large part of what y'all are doing every week on the First Case side of things. And
so, Melanie, when we talk about the power of social media, and especially these days where so many networking events, and two big ones in our industry, AORN and AANA, canceling this year, the online community is a great place to further and continue that education. And I think, Paul found Hank because of what he was putting on LinkedIn, but I think Hank found you because of the work you were putting in at the Circulating Life. And so which way did it go? Did you reach out to him, or did he reach out to you?
No, he definitely reached out to me. I have been running the Circulating Life, both Facebook and on a blog, for about 3 years. And last summer, I got this message from this guy named Hank asking me about, hey, I've seen what you're doing. If you'd like to talk, let's get in touch. And I told my husband, I'm like, should I call this guy? Is this like real? You don't know with the social media if it's safe, if it's good. And actually, first conversation, I had my husband on the phone with me just to listen and hear everything that was going on. And we both, after we talked, we were both like, man, this is exciting. This is good stuff that they're doing. This is something that we want to get in on. And then that kind of led to more conversations about working together and getting First Case started and doing some collaboration with Beyond Clean and the Circulating Life. It's just a lot of fun stuff that we've gotten to do ever since he reached out to me.
So there were some things that came up in a conversation, really specifically around, I'd say, just proper processes in practice and the variation, Melanie, that you've seen in the industry that was just coming to mind. And I don't know if it was just a conversation that was happening on the Circulating Life, or if you read something that really sparked it, or there was an experience. But either way, some of the things that you brought forward were inspecting blue wrap and some best practices there. I'm thinking maybe we can tee this conversation with Hank up by having you just talk about some of those things that overlap between sterile processing and the operating room, and what you had always been taught were best practices, but things that some people kind of let slide versus doing what is, really ideal and in the best interest of patient safety.
Okay, so sterility. That's what we do in the OR. I mean, we need sterile processing to have sterile instruments, and we can't do surgery if stuff's not sterile. But we also can't do things if we don't know it's sterile either. And that's where sometimes the ball gets dropped. We get in a hurry. We get pushed for faster turnovers, for more cases, more volume. And suddenly it's faster to maybe not check your indicators or not check your wrap or not check those filters than it is to sit there and do it right. And when I worked in an academic medical center, it was pushed and pushed and pushed. This is the right way to do it. This is how it gets done. And then here's the standards as to why we check our indicators and we check our filters. And then sometimes in other areas outside of that particular environment, I walked into rooms and I saw that they would just pull their tray out of the container and put it on their back table, and they wouldn't check the filter. And when I asked about it, they just said, well, as long as you can see it on the outside, it's fine. You don't have to take it out and look at it. And I'm going, but no, you do, because you don't know that tray is sterile. You don't know that there's not been some damage done, or there's a hole in the filter. And if you don't look, you don't know. And that's kind of what drove me to think we need to talk about why it is we do this. Why are we checking our filters, and what are we ensuring by doing all of these steps? Even if you feel like maybe it slows you down, it really doesn't, because in the end, it makes sure that everything goes smoothly. But that was, what sparked my idea or my discussion about talking about all of this.
And so you bring me in to break the bad news to all the OR staff.
Yes, that they have to check
So
them.
it'll be my fault, right? It won't be Melanie's.
Yes.
It'll be that Hank guy they brought on the show.
Yeah.
What the heck? Slowing us down on these turnovers. Well,
right.
So you bring up a number of important points, and I'm going to take us completely into left field for a second and talk about a controversial opinion of mine. Thankfully, I'm not alone in this opinion on the sterile processing side of things, but it's the idea that if it's slow in the OR, which I don't think we've had that experience much here with the pandemic and everything, but depending on how electives and everything go, there may be some slow times. It's where we'll send nurses down from the OR to sterile processing to help sterile processing either assemble trays or do various activities down in SPD. And as a sterile processing manager and director, that never sat right with me for whatever reason. I always push back against that. And it wasn't until a couple of years into leadership when I felt like everything began clicking, and it comes back to a lot of what you were just saying. There's a different level of training and competence in areas of sterility assurance and areas of assembling on the sterile processing side of things, what is given to a typical OR nurse in their orientation in their onboarding in the OR. And it's not transferable necessarily. I'm not saying that every OR staff member that goes down into SPD doesn't know what they're doing when they get down there, right? There are many folks that would be and probably are competent. However, as a general practice, to assume just because you're an OR nurse or you're certified OR nurse, and I can plop you down in sterile processing and say, hey, do anything that a sterile processing technician can do and that you'll do it correctly, that is an incorrect assumption. And it's so incorrect that even the Competency and Credentialing Institute, CCI, is aware of the need to provide more targeted sterilization training for their CNOR certificates because they've seen this gap in education because of all the issues that we're talking about. So I'm not even talking about yet what you brought up in the OR. I'm talking about bringing any of that staff into SPD can cause the same types of challenges that you're referencing because of that gap in knowledge. So let me just kind of start there. Number two, though, to address that OR issue, it is just as true. Not that you see a lot of SPD folks in the OR room, right? But you can't throw one of us in the OR and tell you how to set up your sterile field and tell you how to do a correct pass. Like all the things that are not in our orientation, not in our skill set. But then there's this crossover of what does a sterile tray look like? What does a wrap and a pill pack look like that's not been damaged or that has been damaged? That kind of knowledge is crossover knowledge that both teams have got to have in the onboarding process, through their certification process, etc. And yeah, I would say the stories that you reference, those are probably not as rare as they should be. Oftentimes, at least from the SPD side of things, I would guess most of your SPD leaders and technicians are not even aware that that's not being done in the operating room unless we're getting containers down to decontam that still have the filter attached with the filter holder. That's the signal to us, hey, they're probably not checking these in the OR, because if they're checking them and putting them back in and locking that plate back in place, that's a lot of wasted time and energy.
And with that, Hank, you also have the added issue of perhaps somebody down in SPD leaving that filter in and it getting reused, right?
Right. Yeah. That piece about the filter maintenance, if you will, right? There's a lot of different places in that workflow we can go. Like, so to your point, to start off in decontam, if the filter comes back and it's not removed from sterile processing, that's a problem because then it could continue to go through the washers, through the cart wash, and then end up back in a container. Hopefully, it would be caught in the assembly side in the reassembly process, but we don't know. Anytime that you introduce one of those things that should not be in the process, there's the potential that it could make it through the whole process unchecked. At the assembly stage, though, and this is an important point for anybody who's working both sides of the table, if you are working in sterile processing, in assembling those filters, that plate, or that retaining plate, if it's a circle, if it's a square, those things can get loosened over time. And it's very important that just because you see a filter in there and that you see a retention plate on there, you check to verify if that retention plate is snug and tight. Because even if there's not a hole in your filter, if that retention plate can spin with a free hand or you can jiggle that, it's not keeping out the bugs. And that's the whole point of that, right? It's not just to go through the process and make sure that we've done everything, but it's that the process actually works at the end of it. And if that retention plate is loose, then it's definitely not doing that. And the same thing is true with container maintenance in general. So everything can look good, to Melanie's point earlier. There can be locks on the container. The locks can change. There can be chemical indicators inside. They can change. The BI can pass, but if the container itself is bent and there's not a seal on that container, none of those signs and indicators mean diddly, because the bugs can just be going in and out of that bent container lid or that bent container frame. That's why it's very, very, very important, not only for SPD to catch those, but for the OR to be aware of the potential sterility assurance issues in their trays and not just distill it down to, did I check the filter? Did I check the locks? Did I check the indicator? You really do need to be looking at that tray for any issues or broken seals or bentness on the frame.
I think the word that comes to mind when you say all of that is vigilance, because it really takes astute vigilance looking at those trays, every one we open, every single time, making sure that all of those parameters are met so that we know for a fact that we have a sterile tray, because we don't want something going to our patients that isn't sterile, that could lead to an infection or a worse outcome for them than what they want. But vigilance is what comes to mind when you mention all of that.
Another thing is knowing that those trays are being maintained. How frequently should those containers be inspected and reviewed to make sure that all those things are in place, along with checking it at every case, but, by an outside person?
Yeah, so Justin, you may have an opinion on this. Let me give mine first, and then I'll let you jump in because you've got a lot of background on the repair side of things. To your first point, Paul, it needs to be inspected every time by SPD. Like, we are the first line of defense. We're the ones that have the time. There's not a patient on the table waiting for us to leave the room or do anything. Like, we are the ones that have the time to look at the seal, to look at the container, the lid and everything else, check the retention plates. And that's that proactive piece. Like, we're not really talking about instrumentation at this point, but there's a lot of instrument quality programs that only will take an instrument out of service if the OR complains about it. Well, same way, we don't want to have that for containers, that we let the containers get so bad that someone in the OR happens to notice. It really needs to be caught proactively from sterile processing and then sent out for repair. Now, Justin, I'll let you speak to the cycle, I guess, or how often that needs to be done.
Yeah, I would echo everything you said. Really, they need to be inspected every single time. From a preventive maintenance standpoint, they really should go out with the instrument trays on a regular schedule, preferably usage-based. And part of that, too, is because the containers themselves, they're going to be traveling with the instruments, and they're going to get scanned every time that they're used. And if you put them on the shelf and they sit there for 6 months, then there's not a lot of transport or opportunity for the container to get damaged. If it's sitting in front of all the others and it's used 3 times, in a week, then over 6 months, it's certainly going to be more likely to incur damages. What you're going to find, with a repair company that's taking a look at those and inspecting them is that they're going to be able to catch some things, especially with the seal and the gaskets, because gaskets can definitely be subject to dry rot and they can loosen up. And so it's just a nice checks and balances. And when the containers, as well as the instruments, go out for regular service, you've got somebody where that's literally their entire job responsibility. Even in sterile processing, they're checking everything every single time, but the responsibilities of a sterile processing technician are quite varied. And they may be skilled in some areas, et cetera. But I think having somebody with really that experienced focus that's doing that on a regular interval. So typically usage based, but it's still going to be a little bit more focused on instrumentation. But I do know some places they don't want to have to reprocess the containers as well when they come back in. So they'll just take the inner basket and send those out to the repair vehicle. And then you really have containers that are entirely missed from preventive maintenance. And so, I've always recommended that if they go out in the container for service, they're better transported not only on their way out to the repair vehicle, which means potentially less opportunity for them falling over and getting damaged and then needing to be repaired, but also getting damaged on the way back from repair for any reason. They're snug in that container. I think that's really critical as well. And then you get the benefit of putting the containers through a PM.
And Justin, I'll add, this kind of goes back to something that Paul kind of taught me through the consulting years, but this is a great opportunity and a great excuse to bring up some SPD technicians into OR staff meetings, into OR huddles, and to use this as a bridge of communication and education from the experts in wrapping, from the experts in filters, and begin that conversation, that collaborative conversation with their OR teammates, to be speaking to this and to be educating in a non-confrontational manner, right? Because it is a team effort to get these goods sterilized and to keep them sterile until they're ready for the patient. But just speaking to the feedback part of, hey, does everyone know that we're supposed to be taking out the filters? Everyone know how a filter could be penetrated during transport or through the storage and the case cart process, coming up to the stairs. Like, it's just a piece of paper, and there's sharp instruments in those trays that are oftentimes sticking in all different directions on stringers and otherwise. And so it's not surprising and it's not uncommon to have punctures through the paper filter in a rigid container, and then definitely through the blue wrap on any kind of container, more often from the outside coming in on the blue wrap, but for the filters in containers, it's more often from the inside coming out.
Right, because people look at that container as an impervious structure.
Yeah, it's like a tank.
So I can tell you, I've literally seen people walk down the hall holding just the one handle of a rigid container, like a suitcase.
Right.
And
I've seen they stack things on top of them, coffee cups. I've seen like all manner of things that you would think would not get that close to a sterile set of instruments. Because again, the only thing between that and the instruments is that thin sheet of paper that's held up by the retaining plate, and that's it. And that's why, again, any penetration in that filter is a huge risk.
So, Melanie, what are some of the variations in practice that you've seen over the years? Like, how were you trained initially, and was the way you were trained the ideal situation or not?
No, it wasn't. I started out in 2011 in a surgery center. During my orientation, the first nurse that I worked with, she quickly, pulled a filter out and said you were supposed to look at it, but she didn't really say why. And none of the other rooms I worked in when I was orienting did that. And then one day I was helping scrub open for a plastics case. I'm like, oh yeah, I have to check the filter. And she just stopped and laughed at me. She's like, I've never seen anybody pull that thing out. You don't need to do that. And I'm like, oh, okay. I mean, she'd been a scrub for a lot of years and I was clueless and didn't really know what I was doing still. So I rolled with it. And so we never checked filters at the OR that I worked, and I didn't really understand that you needed to. And then when I started working at the academic medical center where I worked, and suddenly I got all the education poured into me as to why we do what we do. And we checked everything. You checked your blue wraps, you checked your filters, and that whole idea of when in doubt, throw it out really held true. If we could not confirm that our tray was sterile, if we didn't know for sure that everything that we had was sterile, we didn't use it. And so having that confidence in your tray and in what you were using was really important.
So, Justin, I don't want you to ask me how I was trained because I didn't have containers when I started working in the OR.
We're going to go back to the muslin days, aren't we?
That's exactly right. It's all green muslin cloth.
Right.
Did you check it for holes?
Yeah, it had the little patches that got sewn on, too.
Now, Paul, you can probably confirm this as well through your consulting experiences in the field. And I know we're talking primarily about wrap here, but I cannot tell you how many pill packs I identified that were patient ready, quote unquote, in the sterile core, in sterile processing, that had penetrations in the pill pack. And I always brought that up as it's just sitting there ready to go. And what we're relying on now is not a process. We're relying on a person to catch this penetration before it reaches the patient, and all over the place. And that has to do with care and handling and packaging. Like, are we putting tip protectors on there? Are we using the right size pill packs? Do we have enough space in our storage? Are we trying to cram too much in too little of a spaces? But that's just as important. And I don't know, Melanie, like maybe you can speak to the common practice of that in the OR today. Like, is as much attention given to pill packs as they are in the filters and the blue wraps from the places that are doing it right?
I don't think so. I think we had a lot of problems too with not having enough space. And so all of our peel packs were all crammed into bins and you're rooting around, digging through it, trying to find what you needed. And you had to be careful. I mean, like you had to look and make sure that your pack wasn't compromised. But another thing that I ran into where I was something that really frustrated me because when I started in the OR, everything was double peel packed. And so you had that separate, safety wrapping on the second layer so that it was easier to open. If, you had that extra layer, things didn't penetrate, both layers usually. And then I guess because of cost, I'm not sure, maybe availability of peel packs, but they'd moved to only single wrapping them. So you would drop them out of the pack when you tried to open them. They would penetrate through the pack and the pack was unsterile. The instrument wasn't sterile. A lot of frustration with only single wrapping the peel packs. And I don't know why. I don't know why they moved from double peel packing to single. Maybe you do.
I'm
Can
not
you tell me
touching
why?
that one. That's a controversial one. Paul, if you have an opinion you're willing to share, but I know I have stuck my head out, one too many times in OR meetings about that one. So I'll let the other consultant weigh in.
From my perspective, it's really a matter of what the manufacturer's instructions for use say. And some of them may say you can double them, others may not. But, it's not just the double peel packing. It's also, the storage. I think, that's another big thing that you hit on, Hank. People usually will have bins or drawers to put these things in, and they thumb through them 50 times a day, and they get all torn up. And in addition to that, the other piece of this that's so important that never gets addressed is inventorying all those peel packs. How do you know how many you have and how many you need? And, you might have some where you have 50 of them sitting in a bin for 5 years and never know it.
Right.
So,
and those are the ones that Joint Commission just happens to find on their little stroll through sterile storage is that 5-year-old pill pack. It has no indicator in it, has no expiration date on the package, and is like the worst one for them to find. But yeah, Paul, that point about the storage actually brought to mind another thing is how we seal these pill packs, because oftentimes you'll see little runs in the fold over to seal that pill pouch. It's not a smooth seal. So Melanie, in the OR, is another one of those education pieces, right? You should be checking filters. You should be checking for holes in wrap. You should be looking at the pill pack seal itself, because for the majority of these, they're not mechanically sealed in terms of like industrial seal. Like there are some like automatic sealers, but even those can cause issues with folds and runs because it has to be perfectly flat as that sealer comes down, or you're just going to seal a little run that goes straight from the outside air straight to the inside of the pill pack. And that's the same exact thing as a hole. And again, like we would find those all the time on our pre-assessment audits and have to show them not only to the sterile processing staff to watch, but also to the OR staff and say, hey, you don't want to use these when they look like this because this is just as unsafe as a hole in it.
So, Hank, I want to end on this one question because you wouldn't believe how quickly the time has passed. Oh, yeah, that's what I'm saying. So there's two terms that I want you to kind of address, and I'm not sure how prevalent the understanding of these concepts is in the operating room, but it's very much directly related to policy and how you approach sterility. And one is event related and the other one is time related. And so I just think, for the audience, it's really important because a lot of that dictates, and most places are event related these days, but I think it really dictates a lot of the approach and even how you would inspect the integrity of any type of packaging for sterile items that are going to the operating room.
Yeah, this is a very hot topic, Justin, and actually we just had a session on it in one of the Beyond Clean virtual conferences we did on sterility assurance back in June. And, even though the majority of facilities out there today are event related, we are seeing more and more regulatory emphasis on time related. And that actually goes back to a topic that Paul brought up as well, which is the manufacturer's IFUs, because we're seeing in these IFUs certain language that gives the impression that it's validated for 365 days or that it's validated for 18 months. And so facilities then are kind of faced with a challenge of, do I ignore these IFUs that everyone always tells me, follow the IFU, and do I follow industry guidelines such as AORN and AAMI that give the impression that event-related is probably the best course to follow as long as you've got it in your policy? So you mentioned this too, Justin. Policy drives this discussion. If your facility creates a policy that says event-related, when a surveyor comes on site or when a consultant comes on site, that's what they're going to be looking for. Are you following your policy for event-related sterility? And if so, that means that you're checking all your packages for any events that could cause the compromised nature of the tray, of the pill pack, of the wrap. If you're under time-related, then regardless of if an event occurs or not, if your time related is, 6 months or 12 months, and that causes you to take that item off the shelf and reprocess, even though nothing was, visibly wrong with it, because you're following, again, that hospital policy that's been put in place. Now, here's the challenge here, and this is where it gets a little complex, because we do have surveyors, there are surveyors in the field today from Joint Commission and from DNV that are kind of pressuring a little bit more toward that time-related scenario. Potentially, I'm not aware of all the reasons why, but potentially because there are so many pill packs out there, to Paul's previous point, they're 5 years old, that there's not technically been a clearly delineated event. But if you look closely enough at the pill pack, there's probably degradation there. There's definitely dust there. Is dust an event? Let's have another conversation about that sometime. Is dropping it on the floor an event, even if it doesn't penetrate the package, right? There's a lot of questions that I think as an industry on the SPD side and on the OR side of things that we should be discussing more around this, and not just like which one of those guidelines do you follow, because it's complex no matter which one that you choose.
This was a fantastic interview, Hank, and I like the way you ended it there, because
with some nuance.
Well, not only some nuance, but talking, I think you emphasized the point that these conversations are not existing in a silo. Right. It's not just sterile processing's job to have these conversations or just the operating room's job to have these conversations. I think having more of these overlapping discussions and more of a forum for it really in the industry is super critical. And so I'm looking forward to the partnerships that we have planned, not only this year, but in 2022. And this episode will be releasing pretty close to the end of 2021. So I'm teeing it up there that there will be a lot of collaborative effort between the Beyond Clean team and the First Case team to find ways to have conferences that are overlapping discussions. And we'll continue to work with our other podcast partners similarly, both for the supply chain podcast, Power Supply, and the infection control podcast, Transmission Control. So thanks so much for coming on. Again, you're the closer. So thanks a lot.
I appreciate it, guys. Thank you again for the invite. Keep up the great work. You're doing fantastic work in the perioperative space. And I know this podcast and this mission for education will continue to grow. So thank you for letting me be a part of it.
That was Hank Balch, president and co-founder at Beyond Clean, as well as here at First Case. I've been working with Hank for, it'll be over 4 years by the time this episode releases. And, Paul, you talked about how you and Hank had met. And I think we could have gone into a real weeds type conversation today. But instead, I think we talked about, some real specifics, but at the same time looked at it from how can we engage sterile processing to help us educate and to talk about these things, because there clearly is a lot that still remains to be defined. And I like how he laid that out with event related, like what equals an event and how do we define that? And I think, boy, it just highlights the need for more cross-collaborative types of conversations, maybe away from the day-to-day of the job, to help us answer those questions in this industry.
You're so right, Justin. And I can tell you on just about every project that Hank and I worked together, these issues came up. It's not just a few organizations that have these challenges. It happens almost everywhere. Now, the degree to which it happens may vary from place to place, but I guarantee you I could walk into any operating room in this country and find a peel pack that has been damaged and is still sitting on the shelf somewhere. There's no doubt about it. So I really think it would be great for us to have Hank back again to talk about many other factors where SPD and the OR meld together. And I look forward to being able to do that in the coming seasons.
Yeah, and even taking it to other platforms like co-sponsored webinars and conferences. We've got a lot planned. So this was a nice kickoff to that and a prelude of what is to come and our big picture vision for really all the podcasts that are kind of working collaboratively between Beyond Clean and First Case and Power Supply and Transmission Control. So excited to start connecting these dots and start breaking down these silos. That's going to do it for this week's show. But as a reminder, you can help support First Case by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, as well as Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or search for us on your favorite podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes by downloading our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. Certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Paul and Melanie and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case.